This is part 3 of the chapter 6 lecture notes on metabolism. This chapter covers photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Here we go. We were talking about photosynthesis when we left off, and we had gotten to the electromagnetic spectrum. So these are the different types of radiation that can be released from the sun. And you can see at one end, at the at the longer wavelength ends, which is down here, this would be longer, those radio waves contain less energy because the wavelengths are longer. Now down here on the left side, on the left end, the wavelengths are shorter, so much more energy is given off from gamma rays. We are mainly just concerned with the visible light portion of the spectrum because these are the wavelengths of light that are captured by pigments in plants. Primarily, it's green, but we do need to know all of the visible light wavelengths of light, all the colors, in other words. And if you can remember Roy G. Biv, here we'll have to do it backwards. Roy G. And then they don't have indigo, but it should be BIV, and the I stands for indigo, which is like a blue color. Okay, so the colors from the shortest wavelengths to the longest wavelengths, meaning the colors on the left end have the shorter wavelengths, but the greater energy. And then red would have the longer wavelength, but the least amount of energy. And here, this explains to you what I was just showing you, that red has the longer wavelength. From crest to crest is a longer distance than it is, for example, down here for violet. That's a shorter wavelength. So the longer wavelengths of light give off less energy, and the shorter wavelengths give off more energy. In plants, plants typically use chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B, or chlorophyll A is really the primary pigment used by plants, but there is a different chlorophyll B. Chlorophyll A and B are both green, but they're different shades of green. And then beta carotene is another pigment that is used, or the carotenoids is sometimes what they're called, and those are in the orange region, the yellow-orange region of the spectrum. So that's where you're going to see the lowest absorption. This is the absorption spectrum. So here between the blue-green and the regular green and the yellows and the oranges is where plants are going to absorb the least amount of light, because that's the colors they are. That means that's the colors they're reflecting. But where the regions where they're absorbing the most are going to be in the violet end. Chlorophyll A absorbs in it's more the blue end, and the red end. And then chlorophyll B absorbs more in the blue-green end and the orange-red end. And then beta carotene absorbs in the green and the green is pretty much the end that's most absorbed with beta carotene. So by having different pigments in the plants can absorb can absorb more wavelengths of light. All right, this is a cross section through a chloroplast. We know that photosynthesis takes place in the chloroplast of a plant, and then there are two stages within photosynthesis. There are the reactions that depend on light. We call them the light-dependent reactions, and those reactions occur in the thylakoid. And remember that stacks of thylakoid are called a granum. So the thylakoids are the little green disc, and they're green because they contain the pigment chlorophyll. And what happens in the light reactions is that water, which it comes from the roots of the plant, is split into oxygen, and then the hydrogen atoms, their hydrogen ions and electrons are used to create ATP and another molecule called NADPH. So these are the products of the light reactions, are ATP and NADPH. And they go on to give power to the Calvin cycle reaction. Kind of looks like the citric acid cycle. It's a cycle of reactions, but different. But it's a different reactions occur here. So in the Calvin cycle, the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is converted into a 3-carbon molecule called Ga3P, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, but you can just learn Ga3P. That Ga3P is the primary molecule that plants use to make food. Now a plant can take 2 of those molecules and make glucose with it. But the Ga3P contains 3 carbon atoms, and it is used to as the precursor to the food for the plant. Okay. Now, light-dependent reactions. We know that in the light-dependent reactions, the pigments, which are located in the thylakoid, absorb sunlight energy, and light has a particle nature and a wavelength nature. So light is absorbed in photons. So a photon of light strikes the antenna pigments of photosystem 2. That's the first step. And this initiates photosynthesis. There are 2 photosystems within a chloroplast. Photosystem 2 comes first, and then photosystem 1. So the first thing that happens is a photon of light strikes the antenna pigments of photosystem 2, and photosynthesis is initiated. The energy travels, it kind of bounces around from pigment to pigment within that antenna complex until it reaches a reaction center that contains a chlorophyll A molecule. It will reach that reaction center, and then it will be transported to the electron transport chain. So there is an electron transport chain in photosynthesis also. And that electron transport chain uses chemiosmosis, using hydrogen ions and electrons, in order to produce ATP. The ATP synthase is located on the thylakoid membrane, and it is used to create ATP, except for this time the ATP is going to be used to power the Calvin cycle reactions. And then the electron that was excited by the sunlight in photosystem 2 travels to photosystem 1, and it absorbs a second photon of light from sunlight, and that excites that electron to a higher energy level, and it goes through this basically the same process, the chemiosmosis that ATP went through to form ATP, but except for it is used to form NADPH, which is going to be a carrier molecule for the Calvin cycle reactions. Since it has an H on the end, it's kind of like NADH in cellular respiration, but it's NADPH in photosynthesis. A photosystem, when we talk about the photosystem 1 and photosystem 2, a photosystem consists of a light harvesting complex, which is just a bunch of pigments. The light harvesting complex is composed of many pigments. And then a reaction center, which always is a chlorophyll A molecule. The chlorophyll A molecule is the one that is found in the reaction center. The light will excite an electron from the chlorophyll alpha pair, which passes to the primary electron acceptor. So in other words, the electron bounces around from pigment to pigment. That's the first thing that happens when sunlight strikes the pigment molecules. An electron is excited and it bounces around from pigment to pigment until it reaches the reaction center chlorophyll A molecules, and then it is transferred from there to the primary electron acceptor. And the excited electron must then be replaced, and it is replaced by, when water splits, the splitting of the water creates oxygen and hydrogen ions and electrons. So the electrons are replaced when the water splits. All right, this picture shows you the membrane of the thylakoids, and it shows you on the left, it shows photosystem 2, which has an absorption spectrum of 680, and photosystem 1, which has an absorption spectrum of 700. So the first thing that happens is a photon of sunlight is absorbed by photosystem 2, and it excites an electron, and what you see is the pathway. This electron travels from pigment to pigment until it reaches those two chlorophyll A molecules called the reaction center, and then the reaction center sends the electron to the primary electron acceptor. And that electron, along with these hydrogen ions from the water splitting, are used in an electron transport chain to generate ATP. So ATP is produced directly from photosystem 2, and then photosystem 1 absorbs another photon of light, which excites that same electron. And that electron travels from pigment to pigment to pigment to the reaction center chlorophyll A molecules in the electron acceptor, and then it's going to use chemiosmosis to create NADPH. Okay? And it is in the first part where photosystem 2 generates ATP that the splitting of water replaces the electron that is lost. It gives hydrogen ions to the electron transport chain, to the chemiosmosis that occurs, and then the oxygen is given off to the atmosphere as, I'm just going to put air, it just increases the oxygen that's in our atmosphere. That's why we need plants. Now this shows you the thylakoid membrane. This entire membrane is the thylakoid membrane. It is a double layer of phospholipids, a phospholipid bilayer, and it shows you photosystem 2 on the left and photosystem 1 on the right, and it also shows their respective electron transport chains. So once the electron is excited and it moves from pigment to pigment to pigment to the reaction center chlorophyll A molecules to the electron acceptor, then that electron travels from these blue molecules in that double phospholipid bilayer are electron carriers, and those electron carriers are what compose the electron transport chain. So as the electrons pass down the electron transport chain, hydrogen ions are pumped into the thylakoid, and the concentration of hydrogen ions builds up inside the thylakoid, and then when it passes back through the ATP synthase, that energy is used to generate ATP, to add a phosphate to ADP and generate ATP. But then that electron leaves the electron transport chain, and it enters photosystem 1, and sunlight excites that electron so that it bounces around the pigment molecules, and then it arrives at the chlorophyll A reaction center molecules, and then the electron carrier, and then it is passed through its own electron transport chain, and is used to generate NADPH. And then going back to this reaction here, this reaction replaces the electron that has been lost, and it also adds oxygen to our atmosphere, and this is what generates the hydrogen